There's a very popular saying that everything down in Australia can and wants to kill you. While a lot of people will automatically think that that's referring to spiders, snakes, sharks, and crocodiles, there's something else lurking out in the outbacks of Australia, even close to urban centers, that's as equally as dangerous, and it can and will kill you if it's given the chance. But before we get into today's encounters, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you would like to have shared on the channel, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, please hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, please boomerang that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. In 2014, Shane was 22 years old and he was living in Brisbane, Australia, which is located out on the eastern coast of Australia. He really did not have a whole lot going on in his life at this point. He had very few friends, he had no girlfriend, and he was working a dead-end job at a warehouse. And he found himself stuck in the same routine of waking up in the morning, going off to work, coming home, and basically spending most evenings completely alone. In June of 2014, just like every other day of his life, with the exception of the days that he had off, he woke up in the morning, he went to work. At the end of the day, he came home and he had a letter sitting in his mailbox. He did not recognize the address on this letter from where it came from, so he grabbed the letter out of his mailbox and made his way into his apartment. Once he was in his apartment, he opened up the envelope, looked inside, and it was a letter from a lawyer's office saying that his uncle had passed away and he just inherited his uncle's property out in West Central Australia. Shane was immediately filled with pretty much just unbearable grief because he was very close with this particular uncle. Pretty much from the time that he was just a kid, he completely idolized his Uncle James, and he thought that he was just an absolute badass because of the way that he lived. He lived way out in the outback. He had this absolutely massive property. He had cattle. And in his spare time, he would hunt feral hogs on his property. And Shane was very drawn to that lifestyle pretty much ever since he was a kid. So that just helped build his idolization of his Uncle James. So this news hit him incredibly hard because in 2009, his parents had passed away and he found himself with no family at all, with the exception of his uncle. And pretty much from 2019 until he got this news, his uncle would make monthly trips from way out where he lived out in West Central Australia to Brisbane to go see Shane. So their bond really grew over the last 5 years. Shane was feeling way too emotional and just completely overwhelmed at this point that he did not even want to call the lawyer. And he figured that he would just do that tomorrow morning. So he put the letter back in the envelope, he put the envelope on the counter, and then he made his way off to bed. And the next morning when he woke up, he called the lawyer. The lawyer said that they had a whole bunch of paperwork that he would need to sign and that he would have to go down to their office. So he made his way down to the lawyer's office. And once he was there, he found out that his uncle did not just leave him this absolutely massive piece of land. He also left him his vehicle, his life savings, along with his 2 dogs, which were bull Arabs, otherwise known as Australian pit dogs, that he used to hunt the feral hogs on his land. Once all the legal paperwork was signed, Shane very quickly found himself having to sell off pretty much anything that did not fit in a duffel bag, did not fit in a suitcase. Then he waved goodbye to his friends and he made his way out to this property. This property was located in between Penjori and Bogar Nature Reserve out of West Central Australia. Shane had never been out to this property before. Even though he grew up idolizing his uncle, he had never went out there to visit him. His uncle would always come to Brisbane to visit him and his family, and he had only ever seen pictures and heard stories of this property from his uncle. So once he arrived at this property, he was just completely taken back at the absolute expanse of it and the terrain that was with it. It was a mix of desert, scrub brush, there were some mulga trees, and on the far northern side of the property, there was a river that ran right through the property, and along this river, the vegetation was obviously a lot more thick, a lot more lush, and he just completely instantly fell in love with this place. Even though Shane loved this property, he was having a very hard time at first adapting to this new lifestyle because he had grown up in a very busy urban center, which was Brisbane, and he was basically accustomed to having all the luxuries of modern day life, like running water, power, having the ability to just go down the street, go to a grocery store to get food. And now all of a sudden he found himself way out in the outback in a small shack. It had one bedroom, a small living room, a small kitchen. It did not have running water. In fact, it did not even have a washroom in it. There was a small outhouse located about 25 yards outside, and the only power that he had was from a very small diesel generator outside. However, over the course of a couple of weeks, he found himself really starting to get accustomed to this new life, and he found himself building a very strong bond with his uncle's two dogs, Bo and Kuda. He also, over the course of a couple weeks, spent time exploring the absolutely massive property and learning how to take care of the cattle, learning what he needed to do on a daily basis in order to make this new life work. And very quickly, he found himself getting into a routine where he would wake up in the morning, he would go check on the cattle, and then he would spend the rest of the day pretty much doing whatever needed to be done around the property. Whether that was driving around, checking the various cattle fences, making sure they were intact, or just doing stuff around the house, he found ways to keep himself busy. Then in the evenings, he would take the dogs, he would load them into the ute, and then he would drive to an area of the property where he had never been before, take them for a walk, and basically just explore around. After a couple weeks of doing this, he found that his favorite place to go with the dogs in the evening was on the far north side of the property, right where that river ran through it. He really found that this area was a lot more enjoyable to walk around in. It was not quite as dry, not quite as desert-like, and he really enjoyed being down by the water. Now, growing up in Australia, he was very versed on all the different dangers of the different spiders, the venomous snakes, crocodiles. However, he never did see any crocodiles in this river, so he always felt safe walking along it with his dogs. This one particular evening, once he was finished doing some stuff around the house, he took the dogs, he put them in the ute, and he headed up to that area by that river. Once he got to where the vegetation was a lot more dense, a lot more thick, he pulled the ute over, parked it, let the dogs out, and then he continued and started walking towards the banks of this river. As he made his way through the brush, Bo and Kuda did what they did every single time he went there. They took off up ahead of him. He could hear them running through the trees, but he did not think anything of it just because that's what they always did when he came to this spot. So he continued making his way through the bush. After about 2 minutes, he broke the tree line. Now he was standing right at the bank of that river. He stopped and he just took in the scenery of the water and was basically just enjoying the peacefulness of that moment. When all of a sudden, about 30 seconds later, all of a sudden he could hear Bo and Kuda from about 150 yards down the river going absolutely crazy. He could hear the barking, he could hear them yipping, and his first thought was that they were on the trail of a hog. That's what his uncle had trained these dogs to do, so that's exactly what he thought was going on. Now, he did not know what to do in this moment because he did not have a weapon on him aside from a knife. He was not a hog hunter, so he did not know what to do if he went after these dogs and found that they were chasing down some hogs. He did not know what to do in that situation. So he stood there for a minute just basically calling out to Bo and Kuda, hoping that they would break their focus on whatever it was that they were focused on and come back to him. After a few seconds, he heard something barreling through the underbrush directly towards him. His first thought was that this was definitely a hog, that those dogs had indeed chased down a hog and now it was running right for him. He did not have any weapons on him aside from a very small knife that he had on his hip, so in a form of kind of final desperation, he reached down, he grabbed this large piece of wood, he held it up, getting ready to defend himself against this hog as soon as it broke the bush line in pretty much any way that he could. After a couple of moments, so all of a sudden, Kuda and Bo came barreling out of the underbrush, and he could instantly see that Bo was in pretty rough shape. He had this large gash right down his side. He was bleeding. So Shane immediately knelt down on the ground. He started looking at Bo's wound, and he realized that the wound, even though it was bleeding pretty good, it was not very deep and it was in no way life-threatening to the dog. So he just put his hand up against it, put a little bit of pressure on it just to slow the bleeding, help it clot. When all of a sudden Kuda turns and runs back through the underbrush, back in the direction that they had just come from. He immediately stood up, started yelling out for Kuda to come back, when all of a sudden from towards the river in that direction, he could hear Kuda just absolutely going crazy, but he was not barking. He was kind of yowling and crying, and you could hear just this absolute massive splashing sound like something's thrashing around in the water. He immediately, in fear for Kuda's safety, just took off in that direction as well. He started running through the bush. He was moving branches, moving brush out of the way. And after a few moments, he ended up breaking the bush line along the shore of the river again, just around the bend. And he immediately saw what was going on with Kuda. Kuda was not fighting a hog. Kuda was in the arms of this absolutely massive, over 6 foot tall, red kangaroo. This kangaroo had Kuda's head in its front arms, and it was shoving him under the water like it was trying to drown him. Shane had no idea what to do. He just knew that he had to get out there and he had to try to save Kuda. So he reached down, he pulled the knife from his belt, and he started making his way into the water as well. After he made it just a couple of feet, he all of a sudden, off to his right, sees Bo break the bush line and jump into the river as well, and Bo started swimming directly towards this kangaroo. After a couple of moments, Shane was still about 15, 20 feet away from this kangaroo and trying to save Kuda when Bo got to the kangaroo first and just bit down on one of its arms. Almost immediately, this kangaroo let go of Kuda, who quickly popped up to the surface and started swimming towards shore, just trying to get away from this thing that was just trying to drown him. Meanwhile, Bo just continued to bite down on this thing. Before Shane could even get up to this kangaroo, the kangaroo turned its focus away from Kuda onto Bo, grabbed Bo, and just shoved him under the water as well. Once Shane got up to them, he tried to push this kangaroo out of the way. This thing took its other arm. It just kept kind of hitting at him, and it was hopping backwards deeper into the water. Shane at this point tried stabbing at this kangaroo, but every time he would go take a jab, this kangaroo would twist and move, and he could just not get any contact against this thing whatsoever. After a fairly lengthy struggle of trying to get this kangaroo off a Bo, the kangaroo lifted its arm up, and Shane immediately saw out of the corner of his eye Bo's lifeless body float up to the surface. Bo was not moving at all, and this put Shane into just an absolute rage. So he charged directly at this kangaroo, again trying to stab at it, when this thing just grabbed onto him and started trying to pull him under the water as well, just the same way that it had done to Kuda and to Bo as well. Shane found himself now in a life or death situation. He had this massive kangaroo that weighed well over 200 pounds pushing down on him. He cannot get out of this thing's grasp. There was just way too much weight. This thing was way too strong. And he found that every time he would try to pull away, this thing would just kind of move forward and put more weight down on top of him. Shane continued to struggle till all of a sudden he could hear Kuda start going crazy from shore, and he could hear Kuda start to swim out towards them as well. At this point, Shane tried to muster as much strength as he could. He ended up again trying to stab at this kangaroo. However, this time he did feel his knife actually make contact with some part of this animal. He does not know where. He just felt the knife hit and go in. Immediately, Upon that, he felt all pressure completely relieved off of him, and he was able to stand up and get a breath of air. He looked, and this kangaroo had turned around and just basically took off across a river and disappeared into the brush on the other side. He immediately headed for Bo, grabbed onto Bo, scooped him up in his arms, and brought him back to shore. Unfortunately, Bo did not make it, and Shane, even though he was trying to revive him, it was just too late for Bo. He had already succumbed to being drowned by this kangaroo. After this experience, Shane made it his personal mission to hunt down that particular kangaroo. And after a couple weeks, he did succeed in actually putting this kangaroo down. He did know that it was that kangaroo because of the wound on its side from when he had stabbed it. Now, if you do not know a lot about kangaroos, especially red kangaroos, in Australia, there are a ton of them. There's over 11.5 million. And even though they will generally try to avoid people, they are known for drowning dogs. When they feel threatened by a dog, they'll try luring a dog out into water, and then they'll proceed to try to drown it. And in very rare circumstances, they will act very aggressive towards people, especially if they do feel threatened. And they are responsible for a lot of fatalities all across Australia, mostly due to vehicle collisions with them just because of their absolute sheer numbers. So they are generally seen as a very docile animal, but at the same time, they are incredibly dangerous, and they really should be given respect and be given space. So if you're ever in Australia and you happen to come across a red kangaroo, try to keep your distance from it, admire it from a distance, and just keep in mind that these things can be incredibly dangerous. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I know this story is a little bit different than what we normally do here on the channel, but because of the nature of this story, I really want to share this one with you guys. And if this is something that you would like to see in the future added into the mix here on the channel, encounters with dangerous animals and stuff, please leave that in the comments. I'd really like to know your thoughts on that. But again, if you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.